to a critique of the false premises of modernity, a critique set out in one of the seminal texts of the traditionalists, René Guénon's The Reign of Quantity. Now, many find this teaching difficult, not least because it asks us to question our very mode of being, and perhaps because it asks us to question an ideology in the form of modernism that has become so set in our minds that any other way of being seems in some sense fanciful and unrealistic. However, the teachings of the traditionalists should not, in any sense, be taken to mean that they seek, as it were, to repeat the past, or indeed simply to draw a distinction between the present and the past. Theirs is not a nostalgia for the past, but a yearning for the sacred, and if they defend the past, it is because in the pre-modern world all civilizations were marked by the presence of the sacred. As I understand it, in referring to tradition, they refer to a metaphysical reality and to underlying principles that are timeless, as true now as they have ever been and will be. And by way of contrast, in referring to modernism, they refer to a particular, though false, definition of reality, a particular, though false, manner of seeing and engaging with the world that, likewise, is distinguished not by time, but by its ideology.
Few authors have been able to have an impact on their readers like that of French metaphysician René Guénon. There are countless people from all over the world who say that reading his work completely transformed their view of the world, especially those who read his second social critique, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, which differs not only from his previous social critique, but also from almost any other, in that he doesn't merely present a list of things he dislikes about the modern world, but thoroughly reviews its nature, causes, and scope using timeless metaphysical principles as a basis. The most important concept in the study of metaphysics is that of the infinite, as every conditioned thing requires some context or principle for its existence, and the only thing that can constitute its own principle, and therefore the only thing that can stand as the first principle of all other things, is the unconditioned or the infinite. And as the infinite cannot allow for anything to exist outside of itself, which would imply for it some form of determination, it must be that all forms of existence are really only the same one thing viewed from some particular point of view. To use an analogy, during a dream, the dreamer experiences a great variety of people, places, and things, and all the while he is completely oblivious to the fact that they are all only outward projections of himself. And this is not affected by the fact that in waking existence, the different beings that an individual comes across have their own consciousnesses and points of view, as these differences only belong to the most external level of existence, lacking any firm reality of their own, and in no way affect the principle at the core of things. For example, an indefinite number of droplets could be conceptualized as existing within the sea, and while any droplet conceived of separately is nothing but sea, and almost like a small sea by itself, the various droplets are able to be distinct from each other, for the reason that no one droplet could be equated with the sea in its entirety, even though the sea is its principle. So how and why do all these limited forms of existence and points of view develop from infinity? Well, it all comes down to what have been called essence and substance, the first being positive and real, the other being negative and only existing in reference to the first. Essence refers to pure, infinite quality, actively expressed, whereas substance refers to infinite possibility, which again only refers to the lack of conditions. And when the infinite quality of essence, using the infinite possibility of substance as its basis, is expressed, everything that can happen will. For example, if a temporal world continued to exist indefinitely, everything that could possibly happen in that world necessarily would. It's also worth clarifying that, as was mentioned earlier, nothing can exist without its principle. And just because something can be imagined doesn't mean it's possible, as there's much that could be imagined without any context, which would lack any reason for being in reality. So every conditioned thing, being the result of essence and substance, must participate in the nature of both to a lesser degree, leading each thing to possess its own secondary essence and substance. For example, it would be difficult to conceive of a cup as anything but a physical object, but as all points of view are only various ways of experiencing the one thing, the principle that the cup represents for the being in this world is not itself of a sensible order, and that principle is its essence, from which it derives its reality, whereas its outward form is only the development of the possibilities of sensibility, like tactility and visibility, in conjunction with those of sense, like touch and vision. and it's this outward form that can be measured numerically, as the closest aspect of the sensible world to universal substance is that of quantity. Naturally, as the one aspect is where a given thing derives all of its reality, and the other is altogether negative in itself, the one lies above that thing, and the other lies below it. And so a focus around considerations that relate to a greater degree to substance has the potential to drag a being towards inferior forms of existence, whereas a focus around the essential is important for bringing the best out of a being or a society. Naturally, if something develops out of a given principle, in the course of its development, it will move further and further away from that principle, even if there are retrogrades along the way. The principle of this world is the atemporal unity of all its possibilities, and so at the beginning of time, as most traditions agree, perfection was reflected to the greatest possible degree on Earth. Humanity was based within a central polar location, there was universal concordance, and as Guénon says, a full spiritual development was as inherent in man as his physical development, and he developed and possessed all his human possibilities, sensible and supersensible, making every man capable of fulfilling any and every human function. At a later time period, this unity of humans had split outwards, leading to the existence of different human types, each fitted to the fulfillment of a different function. But the unity and perfection of the Golden Age was still reflected in the overall structure of societies, where each individual performed the function best suited to the most essential part of his individual nature, through which his day-to-day action became the basis of a spiritual self-realization. In more recent times, the different human types became greatly mixed, and the institutions that supported them broke down, leading to disunity in the human domain. And the current tendency, as though a parody of unity, seeks to make people as uniform as possible, as mere numerical units which serve as tools for a work external to themselves, detached from any higher principle. Of course, to make individual beings uniform in their various outward modes, as those capable of the least positively impactful action could not be forced above themselves, but those with the most potential can be restrained, would be to bring all people down to the level of the lowest. The main characteristic that distinguishes traditional societies from modern ones is that traditionally, the sensible world was considered in its proper context as merely the reflection of something higher, and accordingly was treated only as the basis for a spiritual action and realization. Whereas today, where it's not thought of as being all there is altogether, it is still given an importance in and of itself, in spite of its transience, restriction, and apparent absurdity. An example of this is coinage, the minting of which was traditionally the concern of priests, who would oversee the selection of metals which were universally recognized as containing potent, nonsensible properties, and the selection of symbols to be embossed on the coins. And symbolism is generally the basis of any spiritual action in the sensible world, in accordance with its own character as symbol, such that even as restricted and relative actions as buying and selling could be oriented in the most positive direction possible. Whereas today, where currency is actually minted, it's minted with paper, otherwise it's produced digitally with figurative money as its basis, through altogether illegitimate loans. The development of this world away from its principle is not only realized in the human domain, but also in the external environment, which becomes increasingly disconnected from that principle, although nothing can exist completely separate from it, so that it would really be just an increase in the amount of layers to the illusion. But it's such that for the human being, the opportunity for spiritual action and realization in the sensible world is greatly restricted. This is reinforced by the prevalence of materialist theories, which, due to pretensions around experts and authorities, become widely accepted as fact and set in popular consciousness, as well as humanist ideas such as that of human reason as the basis of all knowledge, which precludes all possibility for knowledge of a superhuman order, and therefore any knowledge with an absolute, i.e. real, character. This all leads to a false sense of the sensible world as its own closed system, in which day-to-day life is lived with day-to-day life as its end and principle. False, like most things in the modern world, in which, as concerns day-to-day life, pseudo-rituals are performed with purely human considerations. As concerns wider society, pseudo-authorities are instituted with a purely human basis. And as concerns worldview, pseudo-principles are extolled with purely human origins and scope, equality, our democracy, etc. These are like caricatures of the ritual action which characterizes traditional life, the spiritual authorities which connect it to a higher order, and the absolute principles which it revolves around. This character of caricature is perfectly in accordance with the final stages of a cycle of existence, where its lowest possibilities are exhausted before its end. These possibilities are those which come after the polar opposite of the principle has been reached, and its inverted reflection follows, such that the reign of quantity is followed by that of inverted quality, which runs alongside the gradual and chaotic dissolution of things back into non-manifestation, until this world has reached its lowest point, where all things are absorbed back into atemporal unity, the basis of further cycles of existence, which, although not contained in time, are still positioned successively in time's principle. A key difference between a passive dissolution into non-manifestation and an active realization of the same thing is that in the one case, the beings contained remain subject to its indefinite change and cycles, whereas in the second case, the full knowledge of the state allows the being to contemplate it from its center, himself becoming that state, and therefore he is not subject to the illusions which develop from it secondarily. This dissolution is affected largely by subtle or psychic entities of an infrahuman order, which mirror those superhuman entities that traditionally served as intermediaries to a spiritual principle. As the subtle state is invariably associated with a duality, these entities can influence the world through various means, one of which being that the materialist mentality leads to a conception of all things in external terms, such that even what's called spirituality in modern times deals solely with relative external phenomena, and as such, a special importance is placed on anything outside of ordinary life, granting a spiritual character even to the least spiritual things, through which mediums and even sorcerers are able to influence people. It's in this respect that Guénon points out the dissolving character of neo-spiritualism and psychoanalysis, but it seems that the more recent digital technology may play an equally great, if not greater, role. The chapter, The Significance of Metallurgy, deals with the easily corruptible nature of materials that are harvested beneath the earth, which make up all the main materials of which digital devices consist, i.e. metal, plastic, glass, and the jump from raw materials to a device that can capture images from the world and transmit them across it is a big one. Even if there is an explanation, it hardly seems like the purely human work it's presented as. The end times are characterized by the full establishment of an inverted parody tradition, which would have its own parody hierarchy, at the center of which there would be a sort of parody king or hegemon. This center of leadership is to be the embodiment of chaos in this world, some one or thing that lacks real essence to the extent possible, something that attempts to mimic the highest principle, said by many traditions to be deformed. Perhaps these ideas ring some bells, although it's always necessary to keep some reservations, as it's too early to be certain, and there's a risk of being misled by any prediction. There's already talk about how, with a little more work, AI could be brought into politics, under the pretense of a superhuman intelligence. But then, as soon as this lowest point is reached, in an instant, through the intervention of some spiritual influence, all things are reabsorbed into their unified principle. In the last chapter, Guénon talks about how, as all things are contained by their principle, nothing in this world can truly oppose anything truly spiritual, nor can any conditioned being avoid fulfilling their part in the greater order. It's even suggested that the development of lower possibilities in this world has some greater value as an integration, perhaps as in this world they exist alongside altogether superior possibilities of various kinds, and for that reason there's no world that's altogether characterized by suffering or chaos. The book ends with this paragraph. The 2 points of view, respectively benefic and malefic, have been spoken of earlier as if they are in some way symmetrical, but it is easy to understand that they are nothing of the kind, and that the second signifies only something that is unstable and transitory, whereas only that which the first represents has a permanent and positive character, so that the benefic aspect cannot but prevail in the end, while the malefic aspect vanishes completely because it was in reality only an illusion inherent in separativity. Nevertheless, the truth is that it then becomes no longer proper to use the word benefic any more than the word malefic, for the two terms are essentially correlative and cannot properly be used to indicate an opposition when it no longer exists, for it belongs, like all oppositions, exclusively to a particular, relative and limited domain. As soon as the limits of that domain are overstepped, there is only that which is and which cannot not be, or be other than it is. And so it comes about that, if one does not stop short of the most profound order of reality, it can be said in all truth that the end of a world never is and never can be anything but the end of an illusion. It goes without saying that this video barely scrapes the surface of such a comprehensive book. There's a lot included that's worth knowing, and it offers an insight seldom found elsewhere, so it's very much a book worth reading. The same applies to his other works.